For the sake of convenience, I'm going to quickly summarize the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, though I won't go into much detail. You can find some additional information on this slide if you're interested. In the late 1800s, Zionism, or the belief that Jews need a nation of their own, gathered support among the European Jewish community, who were often alienated by the newly formed identities across the continent. Many Jews who held positions of power in Europe put pressure on their governments for aid. In 1917, Britain acquiesced, declaring that they would create a state in the Jews' ancient Promised Land in Palestine. They implemented the declaration in 1920 with the Palestinian Mandate, which remains incredibly controversial because at the time the population was 88% Arab Palestinian. Palestinian Arabs immediately asked Britain for independence, which of course it denies. Britain employs its signature divide and rule strategy by deliberately segregating groups to different institutions. There were protests and attacks between Jews and Arabs in Palestine through the 1920s, leading to the formation of several anti-Zionist groups. The leader of one such organization was killed in 1936 in a British manhunt, triggering an Arab revolt in Palestine. British forces responded brutally, killing thousands, and deepening the divide between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. Upon the outbreak of World War II, Britain's attentions and resources were drawn away from Palestine, so they tried to meet Arab demands by, among other things, greatly restricting Jewish emigration to Palestine. This is again controversial because, to be blunt, the Jews very much needed a place of refuge between 1939 and 1945. Phew, alright, with the context out of the way, we can now move to discuss the modern Arab-Israeli conflict. In 1946, some Jews in Palestine began to rise up and attack the British presence in Mandatory Palestine because Britain failed to protect the Jewish people during the Second World War. Britain, increasingly seeing its territory as a liability, turns the problem over to the UN and sets a target for full withdrawal. The UN creates a partition plan that is skewed against the Arab-majority population, outraging Arabs across the Middle East. Clashes between Jews and Arabs escalate into a civil war through 1947, known as the Palestinian War, and no agreement is reached. When Britain withdraws in May 1948, Israel declares independence as a Jewish state. Palestine's Arab neighbors, Egypt, Transjordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, fear what a West-backed Zionist state on their border will mean for them, and decide to invade, kicking off the Arab-Israeli War. In March 1949, peace is negotiated, with Israel having consolidated most of the former Palestinian Mandate. Arab settlements are decimated by Israeli forces. Most Arab towns and cities are left in ruins, and the majority of the Arab Palestinian population are left without shelter or state recognition. Arab countries were outraged by the seizure and destruction of Arab settlements in Palestine during the war. The entire Arab world deeply resented Western intervention and the lack of representation for Arab Palestinians, in part because 700,000 Palestinians fled to neighboring Arab countries for safety. As a result, Jews in Arab-majority countries were frequently persecuted, causing nearly 300,000 Jews to emigrate from within the Middle East to the new state of Israel between 1948 and 1952. In 1956, Egypt, under the control of Gamal Abdel Nasser, promotes a pan-Arabist and anti-colonial policy. Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, taking it from Britain, and closes the canal to Israeli ships. This prompts Israel to invade Egypt, supported by troops and arms from Britain and France. The Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula are captured, resulting in the invading parties being denounced by the United Nations. The UN demands that Israel return the captured land and that troops withdraw. UN soldiers are stationed in Egypt along the Egypt-Israeli border to enforce the peace. Tensions between Arabs and Israelis increased through the 1960s as a result of the Suez Crisis and other events. The PLO was founded in 1964. In 1967, Egypt expels the UN peacekeepers along the Israeli border and begins mobilizing its forces near the Sinai Peninsula. Israel responds with a preemptive attack by destroying Egypt's and Jordan's air capabilities, then attacking the forces of Syria and Iraq. This conflict, known as the Six-Day War, ends with Israel capturing East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, and recapturing the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. Outraged, the Arab states agree that they will not recognize, make peace with, nor negotiate with Israel, and initiate a war of attrition. On October 6, 1973, the holiest day in Judaism known as Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria, backed by other Arab countries, launch a surprise attack on Israel. Israel wins the war in military terms due to the financial and arms backing by West Bloc countries, particularly the United States. The Arab countries respond by sanctioning Western powers, restricting oil productions and export. This results in the 1973 oil crisis, forcing many countries to listen to the demands of the Arab nations. A full peace is negotiated in 1979, in which the Sinai Peninsula is returned to Egypt. After this peace, Arab-Israeli tensions have generally decreased in international terms, but have continued to increase between Arab Palestinians and the State of Israel. Israel is generally guilty of making illegal land grabs, as well as brutally suppressing Palestinian protesters who are often unarmed. Conversely, Palestinian militias and organizations are guilty of using guerrilla warfare and terrorism to sow chaos, hatred, and destruction. Neither side was, or is, generally willing to recognize the claims of the other, and, as the state of Palestine is not universally recognized as autonomous, it is difficult for third parties to mediate negotiations and peace. I should note that there are many other dimensions to the Arab-Israeli conflict, such as Israel invading Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War, but most of these episodes are an extension of the main events discussed, or are part of a proxy war. In any case, most of them are too complicated to discuss in just 5 minutes. For instance, this is my attempt to illustrate the four-sided Lebanese civil war. At any rate, Palestinians have been influenced, armed, and manipulated by other nations in the Middle East, and so many aspects of the conflict can be contextualized as a proxy war between Israel and Iran et al. Anyway, there you have it, the Arab-Israeli conflict in 5 minutes. Ish.